So this is a Lord of Battle, designed by Jes Goodwin, I think in the mid-80s. It's a huge inspiration for me. I really like this sculpt. It has a really cool pose, and yeah, overall nice miniature from very long time ago. I think I got this as a Christmas present like 30 years ago from my cousin. It was painted by a friend of his, and the paint job was a huge inspiration for me. It was kind of a dark armor with a red loincloth and tabard. And as the years passed, the paint job chipped away, and I thought I'd strip it and repaint it as a tribute to that paint job, and as a tribute to this awesome miniature that has inspired me over the years. And I will try to give it the same color almost, and kind of the same look for the armor, with a few tweaks and modifications. I applied a lead belcher undercoat for the armor, and Balthasar gold I think is a good solid base coat for the gold parts that I used for some trims on the helmet and on the armor parts, and also the rings on the shaft of the halberd. I think it looks nice with a little gold to break up the just steel armor that's all over the rest of the miniature. I then made a mix of black templar contrast paint and null oil to shade all the metal parts. I think that's a really great mix for shading. It has a little bit better coverage than null oil, and I think it's really good. This is my favorite shade recipe for metals, and I think it works very well. And it can also be used to glaze, which you'll see later in this video. I don't think the shade paints are really good for glazing. They kind of, I don't know, they don't work as well as I want to, and this mix really works good for shading and glazing. I think the contrast paints are really good for this across the board. And when painting true metal, as I'm doing here, that means using metallic paints, not the non-metal method that's very popular at the moment, or has been for a few years. You have to actually think about it the same way. You have to choose where your shades are going to be, because a big flat metal area doesn't look very good. It works for tabletop, but not if you're doing like this, a little more advanced paint job. So you have to choose where your shadow is going to be. On this blade it's big and flat, and the edges has kind of the highlights more on the top and the bottom. So I chose the big part of the blade. I chose the shade to be in the middle. And on the armor parts, just do it on the undersides of stuff, underneath the arms and legs, and in the deepest recesses, just really thin glazes, and use another brush on the side to remove excess paint and to feather out the glaze to create a really smooth blend. And when you're doing this with the thin layers, the paint dries actually quite quickly, so you can go back to an area during the same session. You don't have to set the model aside to let the paint dry. You just pick an area where the paint has dried and add some shade, and then move on to the next one until you're happy and the whole model is shaded. And I think this is a rewarding process. I think shading is actually more fun than highlighting sometimes, because it's easier also. And you can really see the difference quite quickly. And when doing this, just make the shaded area a little bit smaller each time, and be sure to feather out the glaze. And really, you have to wait until it's dry. If you do this before it's dry, you create really weird stuff. The paint you remove some of the paint and create coffee stains, and tide marks, as you call them, and it looks horrible. So be sure to really wait until it's dry. But since the paint is very thin, you can actually kind of see it drying. It's that quick. And across the armor panels where you have like not flat areas but kind of curved, you have to also think where the reflections would be. You have to shade as you would shade when you're painting non-metal metal. And I'm not gonna go into how you approach that. You have to check out tutorials and stuff on the internet. It's flooded with that, so I'm not a master on it, so probably should go to someone who's better at it than me. But just make a decision on where your shades are going to be and stick with it, and keep shading, because when you paint a miniature, you're like 30 centimeters from it. You're watching it very closely, and what looks good at that distance might not look good at say 1 meter away or more, where most people are going to watch your miniatures. So exaggerate both shading and highlighting, I would say, to make it really work from a distance. And that might look too much up close, but that's what I learned. That's what I had to struggle with, was my inability to shade and highlight enough. My medals looked good, I thought, when I had them up close, but from a distance they were kind of boring. So that's the challenge. And as I said, keep shading and highlighting. Highlighting, I used some chainmail diluted with some water to create a kind of glaze, metal glaze, and I used that on the parts where I wanted the shine to be more visible. And I did this as the same way I do with the shading. Just use a glaze, and I use another brush to remove if you, or your finger, like you can see here, to remove if you do it, overdo it. And a problem with true metal is the shading takes away the metal shine. It takes away the sparkle that the very small particles of metal in the paint create. So in the end, after shading and highlighting, I usually go over the whole area with a very, very thin glaze of metallic paint to just get some of the sparkle back into the shadows. It doesn't do complete justice to the metal, but it brings a little bit back of the shine. And true metal is hard. I mean, it's fine for tabletop miniatures, but if you're doing showpieces or character models, true metal, non-metal metal is the way to go if you want to have control, because metal paints are hard to get really good. And for some hotspots, you have to imagine where some of the highlights on the pauldrons and other parts of the miniature would create reflections down on other parts of the metal. This is the same process as non-metal, but you have to kind of create some hotspots that you kind of put a dot of silver and then shade it back down. And the same on the feet. Usually do the stark highlight and then use the black and the silver to kind of bring the colors together, kind of wet blend, if you call it. And just keep doing this until you have your hotspots. Runefang steel is the lightest silver I've got, and that's what I use. I might actually try some other metals from other brands. I've heard stuff that other brands have better metals, so I might check that out. To create some contrast from the red cloth, I decided to make the armor a little bit turquoise by glazing it with Citadel turquoise contrast paint diluted with contrast medium. I think that creates a kind of a nice cool tone to the armor, and it contrasts well with the red. That's going to be kind of a warm tone. So this is just applied all over the armor, trying not to paint too much on the gold parts, but it doesn't really matter since this kind of a cool tone is nice as a shade for the gold also. So you don't have to be too careful. And at this stage it looks kind of aggressive and very turquoise or teal, but I'm gonna go back and reapply the highlights with the Roomfang steel and the chainmail. So you just go back and create the hot spots once again, because the turquoise glaze is gonna bring down the highlights. So you always have to go back. Whenever you're glazing, you have to go back and reapply some of the highlights. Not all of them, but the hot spots mainly. The gold parts were carefully highlighted with I don't know, remember the gold paints, but Citadel, I think Auric gold and shining gold, what I had at hand. The gold paints are the worst, so I try to not use gold paint as much as I should. These are the paints I'll probably be replacing with other brands, unfortunately, because they have lousy coverage, and I don't know, I don't like painting with them. But this follows the same process as the silver parts, just create hotspots, and since there's so little of the gold, I just quickly made some hotspots in the front upper parts of the rings and stuff like that. Didn't put too much thought into this. If you're super duper careful, you might create some super cool effect with this, but I wanted this to be kind of an old school paint job also, and not be too fancy. Also, when painting gold, you just go lighter and lighter until you actually go into silver. The absolute highest highlight is Roomfang steel on the gold parts also. Sometimes I actually paint gold with just silver and then glaze it with yellow contrast paint. That creates a very different gold, but it's kind of nice sometimes. It's a very yellowy, very high fantasy gold color, but if you want to save some time, just paint the metals, and then after that you just glaze the parts you want gold with Nasdrag yellow or Yanden yellow contrast paint. It's really actually kind of a cool effect. With the armor done, I painted the cloth of the miniature with Mephiston red. It's a really good paint, and this is one of the few paints that sometimes you just have to use one layer, even if it's thinned down. It has such great coverage that you can get away with one layer sometimes, especially if you're gonna shade and highlight with other colors. You can just lay down one layer and then move on to the next step. And this is a very rich and vibrant red, so I think it's good for the red I had in mind. Sometimes you can use Screamer pink or Emperor's Children if you want a pinkish red, and there are other red tones that are really nice, some more burgundy ones, but I wanted the base tone for this to be very, very bright red. I shaded the red with Baraknar Burgundy, a new Citadel paint that is kind of a purplish red burgundy tone. I wanted to bring some cool colors into the red to contrast with the red bright warm highlights. So I created a wash of this and just washed all the recesses with it, and since it's very thin, it's very easy to glaze over this, and I used several layers of this to just bring it down. And then I used Mephiston red again, and I kind of brought up the shading again. So I reapplied on some areas and very thinly glazed over to bring back the shading a little bit, since it's kind of a bit dark, and in some of the recesses where it's not a sharp crease, I reapplied it. And then used some bright red as a first step on the highlights, just glazing over all of the creases where the light would hit the model. I went back and forth with the brighter red. I think it's Evil Sun Scarlet, and moved back and forth with that and the Mephiston red, just creating a nice blend. And sometimes the burgundy had to be reapplied in the shadows. But this is a process that you have to go back and forth. It's very good to use a wet palette for this, so the paints, you have them in front of you, mixed with water, thinned down to the consistency you want, and then you can easily just go back and forth. And here you can see I went back with some shading, and then it's kind of easy to create the glazes and the nice blends. I think Wild Rider Red was the next paint, and this was applied at a smaller area of the creases where the folds are more prominent. And again, here I go back and forth with the paints until I'm happy, because very often you kind of make small mistakes and maybe get a kind of a line of the paint. You want a very smooth blend, even on the smaller highlights. You want to have blends between the different shades. So this is a process, and it's kind of fun. After that, I took some Kadian flesh tone as the final highlight, and just got this as almost this line highlight or edge highlight here on the really most protruding part of the creases. This paint is also thinned down quite heavily, so it flows better, and I use kind of a small brush for this. My big Winsor Newton Series 7, I think I have a size 1, and it's not sharp enough. I have to get another one, so I use a small brush. But after that, I just glazed over all the red with Blood Angels red contrast paint diluted with contrast medium 50/50. And then, as always with glazing, I reapplied the sharpest highlights with a Cadian flesh tone. Just the sharpest edge highlights reapplied here. Yeah, that's the miniature done. As you see, I painted the horns and the axe handle and the base also, but I thought I'd done that in other videos, so this is what it looks like. I think I recreated the old paint job pretty well. I'm sorry I don't have a picture of the miniature before I stripped it. I should have done that, but that was years ago, so I forgot. But I think this is, yeah, I'm quite happy with it. It's kind of a quick paint job, but I think it looks like they used to look in the old days. The old Citadel paint jobs were kind of like this, and yeah, I'm quite happy with the red and the armor. As you can see, the metal parts are not as turquoise as they were. As you reapplying the highlights, the turquoise kind of you bring it down so it looks more like a hue, like the sky is creating reflections. I hope you enjoyed it.